Oh, hello, and welcome to Dark Passages. Dark Passages is a weekly podcast presented by me, Chris Stone, reading stories I've written over the past 15 years or so. Today we are going to conclude Route 66 with episode 7. Route 66 wasn't just full of kitschy motels from a simpler time. It was also littered with roadway diners that reminded passers through of yesteryear. There were 50s style diners with waitresses in poodle skirts and beehives asking, "What'll you have?" while hairy chested cooks in white v neck t shirts pushed cheeseburgers across the flat grill. There were 45s pinned to the walls alongside headshots of Frankie Avalon, Audrey Hepburn, a hip swiveling Elvis in a tracksuit. The polished chrome of Cadillac bumpers glinted from their chosen places of honor. Still, other diners jumped feet first into the alien craze. With Area 51 just up the road a piece, they built themed restaurants with names like Alienated, Abducted, even a vegetarian one named The Big Green Conspiracy. Waitresses in silver spandex and matching go-go boots worked their tables, their green painted skin glittery from their sparkling purple wigs serving out-of-this-world hamburger steaks carved from recently probed cows. Everything flashy, everything gaudy and thematic, just like the hotels, everything designed to lure you in. Rain had stopped at a 60s themed rock and roll diner called Guitars and Cadillacs that boasted to have once served Johnny Cash a cheeseburger. Of course, there was no way to verify this, but it was enough to draw in a few famous travelers into this sleepy little highway exit town. And while it hadn't been the overriding factor for Rain by any means, he was starving, and he figured, hey, if it was good enough for the man in black, then it'd be good enough for him. From the corner jukebox, Nancy Sinatra sang,
I was 5 and he was 6. We rode on horses made of sticks. He wore black and I wore white. He would always win the fight. Bang, bang.
Moon mouthed the words as she focused on her plate of full pancakes in front of her. She was smiling as she doused them in a thick river of syrup until they drowned. Rain sat opposite her in the booth, a half-eaten cheeseburger cooling on his plate, unfinished french fries still bloody with ketchup. He leaned back, unsatisfied, but also still queasy from the death he'd dealt. As soon as the gun had gone off, he'd known that their only choice would be to run. No one would ever believe that it had been an accident. Rather, he would rot in jail for trying to defend Hank's punching bag. The New Mexico police had been alone with the two bodies for almost 12 hours now. Soon they'd have his prints, his DNA, his name. Soon they'd have him. And this was why he couldn't eat. His stomach had never been good at swallowing feelings whole. He knew they had to get moving to put more distance between them and the crime scene. His tense fingers strangled a steaming mug of coffee as he impatiently waited for Moon to finish her pancakes. Moon returned the syrup to the table and grabbed the fork, but instead of eating, she brandished it like a microphone and headed into the next verse alongside Nancy.
He shot me down. Bang, bang. I hit the ground. Bang, bang. That awful sound. Bang, bang. My baby shot me down.
A lady on the other side of the diner was stuffing her face full of pork products, her fingers and chin glistening as she shoved bacon and sausage links into her slobbery mouth. Her obedient husband was dwarfed by her, his plate already empty, leaving only bread crust and plum pits as a reminder of his modest breakfast. He watched her gorged with apathy, unwilling, even unable, to do anything to slow her. The slow guitar strummed, and Nancy sang from her time capsule.
Seasons came and changed the time. I grew up, I called him mine. He would always laugh and say, remember when we used to play bang bang, I shot you down.
Across the diner, a man sat beneath a black and white poster of Johnny Cash with a wrinkled jacket draped over his shoulder. A slender fellow, he sat with his lanky legs crossed at the hip, a white plastic tipped cigar dangling from the loose fingers of his hand that had rested on his knee. His straggly gray hair erupted out of the sides of his bowler hat, the brim of which had faded to an ashy gray. A long, exaggerated goatee connected his chin to his open collar, to where his tie would have been if he'd owned one. A plate of untouched pancakes sat in front of him, accompanied by a cup of steaming coffee. His narrow black eyes blazed into the distance, seeming to focus very intently on both everything and nothing at once.
Bang, bang, you hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, I used to shoot you down.
Moon quietly sang. The waitress, a frazzled woman with dirty blonde hair swept back in a messy ponytail, had a pale face with dark, circled eyes. She wore a pristine white blouse and tight blue jeans. Her order pad was tucked alongside her hip, a pen looped lazily behind her ear. Stitched in cursive on the breast of her shirt were the words, guitars and Cadillacs. Nancy sang on, Moon sang on, and her plate of pancakes waited. Rain was getting antsy. It was time to get moving. He'd used most of the last of his cash on this meal. Since the old Plymouth drank gasoline, he wasn't sure how far they could make it with what they had left in the tank. California was still a full Arizona away. He'd be lucky if he could make it to Windsor, and then things would get interesting.
Music played, all people sang. Just for me, the church bells rang.
He'd seen it in the movies. Couldn't he just walk up to the guy in the bowler hat and press Hank's revolver into his face and demand money? Of course, he couldn't stick up the whole place. This was real life after all. Someone would try to be a hero, and then things would get all fucky. So, he couldn't be so brazen. Rather, he could of course do it in the parking lot. Just wait for the lanky man to finish his smoke, follow him into the parking lot, and bang bang shoot him down, if it came to that. He wasn't sure why his eyes were drawn to the stranger. Was it the suit, the fancy white tipped cigar, the possible hint at money hidden in those deep jacket pockets? Moon crooned.
Now he's gone, I don't know why. Until this day, sometimes I cry. He didn't even say goodbye.
Or perhaps the couple. He could see the guy being a parking lot pushover, a real television tough guy. He could just walk up right behind him, cram that snub nose into his lower spine, and demand money. Sure, his fat wife would caterwaul and scream and cry. He could see it in her face. She'd be a problem. She would raise a commotion. His mind kept drifting back to the dark stranger with the long goatee.
He didn't take the time to lie. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down.
Moon sang. The tall stranger snuffed his cigar into the middle of the stack of flapjacks and twisted it. He got up and headed for the bathroom. This was perfect. This was Rain's chance. A man with his dick in his hands was never in the mood for a tussle. It was just one of life's constants. He could walk up right behind him in the bathroom, place the gun at the base of his skull, and demand his cash. When he complied, he could cold cock him and leave him laying with his face in the urinal. It would give them time to escape before someone happened in to find him face to face with a urinal cake. Rain's fingers went for the gun tucked in his waistband, and he started to stand when the chime over the diner door clanged. Nancy Sinatra was done, and the diner was silent as the Rockola Bubbler jukebox's mnemonic arm grabbed another 45, its rainbow fluorescent lights pulsing. Above the jukebox, a poster promised that some band called the Highwaymen would be playing at Guitars and Cadillacs this Friday night. From the corner of his eye, Rain watched as two uniformed police officers entered the diner. Half risen, he slunk back into the booth. The oblivious, tall, gray-suited man made his way to the bathroom. I hear the train a-comin', it's rollin' round the bend, Johnny Cash began singing. And I ain't seen the sunshine since I don't know when. I'm stuck in Folsom Prison, and time keeps dragging on. Moon saw the police too. Her eyes were saucers, and a slobbery wad of half-chewed pancake tumbled out of her mouth. Rain caught her eyes and urged her to remain calm. The waitress greeted the officers as they sat down on the bar stools that stood sentinel in front of the lunch counter. Cash's low baritone voice crooned on. But that train keeps on rolling down to San Antone. When I was just a baby, my mama told me, son, always be a good boy, don't ever play with guns. But I shot a man in Reno, just to watch him die. The officers sat down on the stools, their guns dangling loosely from their hips. The waitress popped 2 saucers in front of them and tapped tiny mugs into their indented surfaces. She tipped the coffee pot and sent the steaming joe into the cups. The men removed their trooper hats and sat them on the counter beside them. They smoothed back their sweaty hair as best they could.
What's the good word today, fellas?
Their backs were to Rain. He could still hear most of their conversation.
Oh, you know, Missy. Same old shit. Dead coyotes and abandoned cars. The usual highway drama.
Good. He still had time. They weren't on his tail, at least not yet. He could drop the last of his cash on the table and just get up and sneak out.
Well, here's hoping things look up for you two today.
She offered, returning the coffee pot to its warming plate. She hollered over her shoulder.
The usual, fellas?
Yep.
One of the officers replied. Rain glanced at Moon. She was frozen in fear. The fork she was singing into a few moments ago was now trembling in her hands. He reached across the table and touched her hand. She jumped and dropped the fork. It clanged onto the plate and splattered syrup onto the tabletop. Slowly, her eyes turned their attention away from the cops and to Rain. They were red with tears. Rain whispered, "Look, if they knew us, they'd already have us. They aren't here for us." She shook her head back and forth in disbelief, tears starting to roll down her cheeks. "Listen, you have to calm yourself. We aren't fucked yet. When I let go of your hands, quietly, and I mean fucking tiny mouse-footed quietly, get to your feet and head to the door. Don't look at them. Don't look at her. Don't look at me. Just head for the door. I'll be right behind you." She continued shaking her head violently back and forth. "Moon, you have to do this. Without you, I'll be dead." Again, he was surprised to hear her words escaping his lips. "This is the only way we're going to see the Pacific." She bit her lip and slowly shook her head in agreement. He let go of her shaking hands and she remained seated. In the near distance, the waitress cracked a couple of eggs over the fry top and added 4 strips of bacon. The officers drank from their coffee mugs. In the distance, Johnny Cash sang on. "Moon," he quietly urged. She nodded and slowly rose to quivering, unsure legs and shuffled toward the front door, her head low, her hands shaking. It wasn't a far jaunt to the door, but to her in that moment, it felt like a lifetime away. When her hand did finally touch the glass, one of the officers' radios squelched to life and she almost screamed. One of the officers leaned his head to the right, depressing the mic on his shoulder with his cheek.
What's that, Sally? You didn't come through clean.
The radio hissed and squelched, but 3 words came across that were unmistakable. 1960 Plymouth Dart. Moon's hand froze on the door, tears rolling down her cheeks. The scene behind her played out only in reflections. One of the officers leaned over to the other. "Hey, didn't we just see one of those big old Plymouths in the..." The other officer pressed a finger to his lips, begging him to hush. He thumbed down the volume on his radio and placed his hand on his holster. Rain got up, his hand buried in his waistband, his shirt untucked, concealing most of what he was getting ready to do, his jacket swooping down around him like a gunslinger of old. And truthfully, down here in the desert, in the shitty little roadside diner, that was exactly what he felt like. A cowboy of yesteryear, or maybe a goddamn bandito, depending on who was writing his story. His fingers deftly wrapped around the gun handle, tingling from the tactile sensation that it caused. He started across the checkerboard black and white tiled floor, careful to keep his boot heels from clicking. But he didn't head for Moon and the Plymouth as he had promised. Rather, he was walking up behind the cops. The jig was up. He knew that they were in the diner with the suspect that Sally had just released the APB on. It's what he got for having such a unique car. There would be no escape. Moon stood at the doorway, her hand on the glass, the bell above her as silent as the abandoned church bell in Cuervo. So much for her prayers of protection. Fuck all good that did. She was frozen while whatever was going to play out behind her did. She expected to feel one of those cops in any second, pushing her to the ground, half in the desert and half in guitars and Cadillacs, a knee in her back, cuffs on her wrists. The waitress spatulaed the eggs and bacon onto a couple of plates and took them back to the waiting patrolman. Smiling, she placed the runny eggs and burnt bacon, just like they liked them, in front of them, but her smile disappeared when she noticed Rain creeping up behind them. Rain hadn't factored the goddamn waitress into his equation, and here she was about to give him away, about to ruin his surprise. Her eyes bulged and her mouth began to open. He was out of time. He ripped the gun from his waistband and fired at a distance of about 10 feet, far further than he'd planned. A bullet ripped through the shoulder of the officer on the right with a puff of blood, and continued through the glass pitcher behind the waitress, which exploded in a spray of brown glass, leaving her screaming. The shot's force sent the officer lurching forward, where his face slammed onto the counter, obliterating his front teeth and filling his mouth with blood. His hand went not for his shoulder, but for his sidearm. The officer on the left kicked himself spinning on the stool and ripped his sidearm from its holster as he spun to face Rain. Rain pulled off another round like a cowboy at high noon. He'd gotten the drop on them, even with the goddamn meddling waitress's last-second warning, and now he wouldn't be done until his killing was done. Behind him, Moon screamed. A second fired bullet exploded through the officer's chest. He tumbled off the stool, clutching his spurting wound, falling on both knees hard enough to crack the floor tiles. He rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling, his hands desperately trying to hold his heart inside his chest. Suddenly, an intense pain ripped through Rain's arm, and he heard the crack of bone and tissue as a bullet lodged somewhere in his collarbone. His extended hand dripped tears of blood onto the white squares of the checkerboard below, and he fell. Bang, bang. He shot him down. Laying on his back, he tasted blood, and it made him angry. He lifted his head and aimed his gun between his spread legs toward the remaining officer, the one that had shot in the shoulder to start this whole war, the one that was now red-faced, screaming at him. He held his gun outstretched with both hands, 8 interlaced fingers, his weary arms resting on his thighs, smoke still wafting out of its muzzle. They lay on the floor opposite each other, the officer screaming murder and Rain already feeling dizzy from lost blood, both with their guns aimed at the other, both on their backs, both waiting for the other's move. Rain could only make out every other word from the screaming officer. His remaining bloody teeth clenched as he screamed,
Drop!
Rain watched the officer scream, his face red and exaggerated, blood leaking down the corners of his mouth, his finger tensed on the trigger of the outstretched sidearm. Seemingly miles away, he could hear Moon crying. Above them, the overhead fan clicked on, like an approaching chopper providing some air support for the apocalyptic diner battle.
Gun!
Rain wondered if this is how his mother had felt at the end, that knowing acceptance of death, that drowsy, overwhelming feeling of calmness in such a state of insanity. He briefly thought about how Moon must envy him. Here he was so close to certain death, and there she was so far away from it, with all of her scabs and scars of trial and error. Moon the Cutter. He was sure of that now. Moon the Third, queen of the self-harm clan. Those tiny little bathroom scratches that puckered in her arm sore, all self-inflicted, all self-imposed. She'd been looking for something, anything to feel. Rain wished it could have been him. He would miss her and all of her insanity. His chest pounded and his breathing grew ragged and labored, hinting that the bullet may have done a bit more than just minor shoulder damage. The officer was still screaming, Moon was sobbing, and the fan was still clicking overhead, but Rain was calm, and he no longer heard any of these things. Instead, he only heard Johnny Cash wrapping up his song. Far from Folsom Prison, that's where I want to stay, and I let that lonesome whistle blow my blues away. The pool of blood below, his blood, was warm and sticky, like pancake syrup. He thought of Moon and smiled. He closed his eyes and pulled the trigger. He took one breath, one last, soothing breath. And that breath, it tasted more like burnt coffee than blood.
You don't mind if I smoke, do you?
Moon asked as they roared down the highway, her slushy gone, the straw chewed flat. She was antsy. Rain twisted a hand in her direction that suggested she could do just that. Moon popped a cigarette in her mouth and lit the tip. She cracked the window and blew smoke into the stale desert air. She leaned back in her seat and propped her feet up on the dash as she liked to do.
You ever find it odd that your name is Rain and I met you in the desert? Bit of a dichotomy, don't you think?
She smiled around her cigarette. Rain grinned. You know, never really thought about it that much, but yeah, now that you mention it, I guess that is kind of weird. She sat back upright, the cigarette pinched between her middle and forefinger.
And you met a girl named Moon. The moon controls the tides. We represent like 2/3 of the goddamn water cycle, and yet here we are, flying through a parched alien world.
Rain drove on. She inhaled more smoke and blew it out the window. Satisfied, she pitched the cigarette out the window, its orange blaze pinwheeling down the street behind them.
Desert rain. I like that. You sound like a desperado or something. You should totally go by that nickname.
She smiled, and they drove on. And that concludes Route 66. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Passages. Please join us next week as the story continues. As always, if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, share, and rate and review us on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. Please follow us on dark.passages.podcast on Instagram for additional information and episode release schedules. Original stories are all written by Chris Stone and are available on Amazon as ebooks. I'm Savannah, thank you for listening, and we will see you next week.